So thank you very much and welcome everyone. I am Bridget Greenwood. I am the founder of Bigger Pie. Bigger Pie is a global community of leaders and learners in the blockchain and emerging tech space. And its purpose is to connect and support the incredible women who are already in the space. We want to shine a light on the work that they do to highlight these role models and make sure that women have a platform to share their expertise at events, on panels and on keynote stages, and enable them to learn and develop their careers whilst we're attracting more women into the sector. And I think importantly, making sure that we retain the women that we are attracting this sector. And part of that includes education. And this is why we're holding this event today. And then we're doing a series of events so that we can indeed learn from the industry professionals. Now, I am very excited to have Keir's book. We'll share a link in the chat so that you can purchase a copy of your own later on if you'd like to. Keir, you started the book by saying a blockchain allows you to create a unique, unforgeable and unalterable digital item on a computer network with clearly defined ownership. Digital objects that are as real as physical objects. That's an extremely significant technological revolution. And I truly believe blockchain is eventually going to bring along huge changes that will impact us all in all of our lives in all sorts of unpredictable ways. And we're seeing blockchain being used to give alternative to financial systems. That's how Bitcoin came about. It's for identity. We're seeing it across supply chains. It's being used in agriculture and for provenance, transforming the energy sector. We've seen a lot recently about the transformation in the art world with NFTs and so much more. But across all of the rapid innovation, it's left a number of weaknesses and financial disasters in its wake. So Keir, you're going to take us on a journey as we start by looking at the fundamental principles behind blockchain, decentralized ownership and governance through incentivization, and the attribution of value to tokens, to the different agencies involved in blockchain, both good and bad, and the risk that they bring, and to examining some failures in the DeFi world, looking at how they happened and how the community has responded. For those of you who don't know, Keir Finlow-Bates as the author of Move Our Brokers, Here Comes the Blockchain. We'll give that as many plugs as we can. He's the founder of Chainfrog Oy, one of Finland's earliest blockchain startups, and is a prolific inventor of blockchain technologies. He lives in Finland with his Finnish wife and 8 children, and none of them who are left home yet, as he says, but they are a bit young to leave home. So, Keir, please, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Bridget. So the title that we selected for this talk was Blockchain, Pitfalls versus Profits. And I'm going to divide it up into 3 sections. There's going to be a section on blockchain and Bitcoin, just to kind of summarize what they're about and maybe draw out some things that people aren't generally aware of. And then in the middle, I'm going to actually talk about the industry of software and where we are with that and how our software development history affects the way that we've gone about implementing and deploying blockchain and why it doesn't always work. And then in the final, probably the most fun section, I'm going to be talking a bit about some of the disasters that have happened in blockchain in the past, explaining a bit as to what it is all about, because it's one thing to see a headline that says, $150 million worth of crypto coins stolen. It's a bit more interesting to understand how that happened. Hollywood makes a great living on making movies about bank robberies and things like that. So maybe one day we'll see similar kind of movies about the things that have gone on in blockchain. I certainly hope so. So that's a quick overview. And I guess I'll just dive straight in and start off with part 1, which is I've titled Blockchain and Bitcoin. So to begin with, I think we need to look at the question, what is a blockchain? And what does a blockchain offer that a traditional database doesn't? And Bridget already read out a section in my book about what blockchain offers. And I think maybe looking at what a database does is therefore a good start. A database allows us to organize data in a structured manner so that we can retrieve it and search for it efficiently, and we can alter it. Those alterations are then recorded. And in that respect, a blockchain is almost identical. It is a kind of a database. You can't change previous records. It has this immutability. You can only append to it. But other than that, it allows us to store data and then seek out that data later and do stuff with it. And so if you talk to a developer who hasn't looked at blockchain in detail and they're looking at it from a development perspective, you often hear people say, well, why wouldn't you just use a database? And the answer to that is that blockchain isn't solving the problem of searching for and storing data. It's solving a bigger problem than that. It's solving the problem of decentralized ownership in a digital space. And so really, in order to understand blockchain, you need to understand ownership. And ownership is something that we have a kind of instinctive understanding of. You only have to go to a playgroup, 3 or 4 year olds, and you'll see that they get it. They have a very clear concept that this toy is mine and you're not supposed to play with it. And in the real world, ownership kind of falls into a few categories. You have owning a physical object. So I have it in my possession, it's in my house or in my wallet, and you don't have it and I have control over it. In the digital world, it gets slightly different. You generally own something by keeping it secret. So if I have photographs that I took, I keep them on my personal hard drive and I don't share them with anybody else, then I'm the only one who owns them. As soon as I put them out on the web, people can copy them and distribute them how and as they like. One of the things that we've done in the digital world is we've involved central authorities. We delegate the responsibility of guarding possessions, in quotes, in the digital world to a gatekeeper. And in fact, here I should mention another form of ownership is if you have a registry or a ledger that says that you own something. So I can't physically carry around the plot of land that my house is on, but the government keeps a registry of who owns land. When I sell that land on, my name is taken off the registry and somebody else's is put in its place. And it's these registries that I think are the best analogy to what blockchain does, in that it registers ownership in a kind of registry. Now, traditionally, we've used these central authorities. So you have things like banks or government land registries, things like that, keeping track of who owns what. Therefore, you have a gatekeeper, or in the case of, for example, a stock market, you have brokers. And having these central authorities has worked reasonably well for us over history, but it's not always good. And blockchain came in and solved the problem of managing a ledger of who owns what without having to have that gatekeeper. And so now I want to briefly sidetrack into something called proof of work, which is what the most famous blockchain uses in order to ensure that this ledger is maintained properly, that we don't have double spending, where people can spend some Bitcoin on one occasion and then spend the same Bitcoin again at another occasion. And actually, the reason I wanted to bring up proof of work is because when you look at the history of blockchain, you'll see a lot of names that crop up: Adam Back, Nick Szabo, Hal Finney, Satoshi Nakamoto. In that list, you'll see that they're all men, except possibly Satoshi Nakamoto. And because it's Bridget's setup here, I thought I would like to highlight the fact that proof of work was actually invented by 2 women, Cynthia Dwork and Moni Nawa, in 1993. And given that it's such a key element of how Bitcoin works, it surprises me how infrequently a name actually crops up in kind of historical discussions of Bitcoin. And what Cynthia and Moni did was they came up with a scheme for combating spam email. And you'll see in a moment why that's relevant to open, public, permissionless blockchains and to proof of work. They had this idea that we have a problem with spam email. There's no cost associated with sending out 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 emails. Would there be a way of somehow enforcing a cost on sending an email that would therefore mean that spammers can't send these vast quantities of emails and therefore making our lives a little bit less miserable? They came up with an idea that you should make people who are sending emails do a bit of work, rather their computer do a bit of work. And the scheme that they had was this idea of conducting this what's called hashing. It's making your computer cycle through a random number generator again and again and again until it comes up with a random number that is really small. And then you attach that number to the email, and it proves that you've done some work. Maybe the cost in terms of time is 1/10 of a second. That doesn't affect the sender of a normal email. But if somebody's trying to send 100,000 or 1,000,000 emails, that time adds up and it becomes infeasible for them to send out that vast quantity of email. And Satoshi Nakamoto took that idea and applied it to the Bitcoin system. It's the sort of underlying principle that maintains the ledger. In order to add transactions to the ledger, you have to do a bunch of work in order to prove that you're allowed to do so. And it builds up this chain in the ledger of more and more work. And it means that people can't go back and rewrite history because they would have to redo the same amount of work. So that's Cynthia Dwork and Moni Now, and that's their contribution to the blockchain world. So that's one of the issues that has to be overcome in blockchain. Another one I wanted to briefly talk about is something called Sybil attacks. And they're named after a patient whose name was kept anonymous, and the patient had multiple personality disorder. So the psychologist who was looking into the condition used the pseudonym Sybil. We now use that in the computing world in order to talk about cases where people set up multiple accounts in order to subvert a system. And if you have an open permissionless system like a blockchain, where anybody can set up an account to use it, some people are going to set up hundreds or thousands of accounts and use them to have a greater influence over, for example, voting that might take place on the system. And they should be allowed to. Again, proof of work can be used to overcome those kind of problems. So those are sort of two of the technical issues that were resolved in order to make blockchain work. And one of the great things that an open, permissionless public blockchain does is, by being decentralized and not having a gatekeeper, you get something called censorship resistance. There isn't a central authority that can decide arbitrarily to block any particular transaction. And this is important because if you take, for example, banks that handle financial transactions, they have the right to block your transactions. And sometimes this is good. For example, when they freeze the assets of criminals. But sometimes this can be bad. We had cases in the US where banks or credit card companies were basically telling their customers, yes, we know it's your money, but we're not going to allow you to buy cryptocurrency with it. And cryptocurrency was perfectly legal. So really, they should not have taken that decision. But it showed that they do have the ability to arbitrarily censor transactions. And of course, this is a subjective problem in that, well, to use an aphorism, you may have heard the expression that one regime's freedom fighters are another regime's terrorists. The gatekeepers may decide that they think the activities that are being undertaken are bad activities and should be stopped. And you may personally think they're good. The difference here, of course, is that the central authority ultimately has the complete power over the system, and you can do at best is appeal. So the other downside of having gatekeepers is that they can charge you for the service. And when we use credit cards, we're paying a fee in order to maintain and run and set up the financial system that it relies on. So it's not, again, clear cut, because of course, if you're using a blockchain system, you are also paying a fee, but at least you're paying the fee in the form of transaction fees to the entire system and not to one central company that's profiting from it. So it becomes a bit more democratized. There is nothing stopping you from running a mining node for a blockchain system in order to take some of the fees that are being paid. Whereas I can't decide that I would like to share in the profits of a private bank, for example. If it's a public bank, then I could buy shares in it, but that depends on the particular corporation that's running the system. So I've talked a bit about the kind of blockchain background. If you're really interested in understanding the nuts and bolts, this opportunity to plug my book one more time. I cover a whole bunch of these things in that book, and it is an entertaining and educational read. So I suggest you go and look there, or there are plenty of articles online as well to go and look up. So I wanted to keep the first part fairly brief, because I think most people who've come here probably have some kind of concept of what blockchain is all about. And now I'll move on to section 2, which is about the software industry and quality. And there's this saying in the software industry that when you're producing a software product, you have 3 things to consider. You have quality, you have cost, and you have time. And the problem or the bind in software is that you can pick any 2 of those 3. You can make a product that is cheap to produce and that you make quickly, but then the quality will suffer. Or you can make something that's high quality and cheap, but then it's going to take you a long time. And you can make something that is high quality and is produced quickly, but then it's going to cost you a lot more money. And actually, it gets a bit more complicated than that, because as you, for example, pay for a large team of developers, you see a problem in that there are more and more people who have to communicate in order to produce the product. But I think that quality, cost, time triangle is a neat simplification of some of the issues that are caused when working in software projects. And of course, a blockchain is fundamentally a software product when you are actually getting down to the nuts and bolts and developing it. Now, one of the problems that we have in software development is that we've built up this culture of, I think it was Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg said, move fast and break things. Back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when you were programming, you made these software products and you put them on a cassette or a floppy disk and you mailed them out to customers. Now with the internet and with all the software libraries we have, you have things like web app programming and mobile app programming, where you can push a product out, and then as you discover bugs, you can fix them and automatically update them. I'm sure you're all familiar when your phone says it's updating this program, or if you ever use something like Microsoft Teams, for example, you'll find that you miss your meeting because it spends 5 minutes updating to the latest version because there's some fix pushed out there. One of the problems this web app programming paradigm has brought is that the decision is made again and again to go for reduced cost and decreased speed, because you can catch up with quality later, except that it's not quite as simple as that. The architectural decisions that are made in a rush can have long-term ramifications and can actually be quite difficult to unpick and untangle. So that's kind of a summary of where we are in the development world. If you go back to, for example, you can look at things like the Apollo moonshot, something that I like to call moonshot programming. They actually wrote computer programs that ran on the spacecraft, and they were faced with a problem that once they launched, if there was a software problem, unless it was a very, very simple one, it couldn't be fixed. And we used to also have this kind of problem with embedded software, where if a device had a program running inside it, like a watch or some early IoT device, you flashed the software into it, it was very hard to update it. There might be 1 or 2 upgrades in its life cycle. And so the program had to be a lot more careful about their coding, and it required a lot more testing in order to ensure that you weren't shipping out something that then later turned out to be a dud, and you had millions of these devices sitting out there that were dead. So we do some history that we can draw on in order to look into how programming should be done to ensure that the quality is as high as possible. But the vast majority of programmers there are now familiar with this move fast and break things paradigm. So this leads me on blockchain. And the issue that you have with blockchain is that it goes back to this more inflexible programming paradigm, that if you launch a blockchain and you have nodes that start running to maintain it, and you've set all the parameters for your blockchain, it becomes very, very hard to make changes. If you decide, for example, that you want to move from one consensus system like proof of work to another one, such as proof of stake, you need to convince the participants on the blockchain that is indeed a good move. So you really want to make sure that you get it right, or as right as possible, the first time round. Because in programming, you can't get it 100% right immediately. There will always be bugs, but you can make sure that the list of bugs is as small as possible when your code is put out there. And so if you're looking at deploying a blockchain, you should be paying close attention to quality. And similarly, if you're deploying smart contracts, which are programs that run on a blockchain, again, because of the nature of blockchains, they can be very hard to update. There are tricks that you can use in order to upgrade your smart contracts as time goes on, but they are tricks and they have some issues associated with them. So again, before a smart contract is launched onto a blockchain, it really pays to make sure that the quality is as high as possible. So how do you go about that? Well, it does really boil down to testing. And one thing that the blockchain does is you'll find that for any blockchain worth its salt, there is a parallel blockchain running known as a testnet. And in some cases, there can be 4, 5, or even 6 testnets. So Ethereum, for example, has at least 4 that I can think of off the top of my head, for people to check that everything is working before they spend real money to deploy their program. So I'll sort of go back a bit to quality and its sort of sibling security. How do we end up with it being nice to have? And the answer there is that it boils down to basically business practices. When you're looking to sell or gain traction for a software product, you are primarily looking at making a profit. And you can ask yourself the question, if you go to buy a car and you're talking to the salesperson, what kind of questions are you going to ask them? You're going to ask them, what's the top speed? What's its fuel efficiency? Can I have a sunroof with that? I think very few people ask a salesperson, how testing did this car get? It's not something that's at the top of your mind as someone purchasing a car. What's the safety of this car going to be? And the reason for that is that we rely on regulation, and we rely on the fact that the governments have passed laws that say that need to meet certain thresholds before they can be sold. You cannot go and produce a car and mount a big spike on the steering wheel anymore. The bad news is that there were actually models of cars like that in the 50s. Experience has shown us that's not a good idea, and laws have passed that said cars have to meet these certain standards before you can sell them. And this is the problem when you look at something like blockchain programming. We don't have the same kind of regulation in place, and we don't have that demand at the moment. Again, in traditional programming, if you're going as an enterprise to buy some software from another corporation, you may make demands. You may say that I want it to meet ISO 9000 standards, for example, or you may demand that there's a high quality security audit on it. But even those things have problems. For example, I worked as an ISO standards compliance officer at a previous employer. Sometimes it felt a bit like rubber stamping to me. You checked all the boxes, but there wasn't really a passion on the part of the company to make sure that we met these standards. It was just, can you please make sure that we can tick the boxes, and that when an auditor comes in, they agree that those boxes had been ticked correctly. So this is the thing, quality and security become business decisions. They're not anything in terms of kind of developer pride, or certainly in the early stages, for example, startups, they go on the back burner because they're expensive. And you want to make sure that you've got market traction, that you've got a good customer base before you start putting money into those kind of things. Ironically, it makes them seem like a bit of a luxury, which, as you can see in the long run, they're definitely not. I guess I can compare it to having fire insurance on your house. Anybody who has a house, you know the odds of it burning down are very low, but you know that the impact, if it burns down, is going to be very high on the life that you're leading. But the cost of fire insurance is relatively low. Imagine if it costs you 20 or 30% of your yearly salary to get insurance for your house. Would you still buy it, or would you take a gamble and say, I'm just going to risk that it doesn't burn down? And another thing we see is that as a result of this, when you look at salaries, you'll find that test engineers get paid less than developers, although get paid more than tech writers. For example, a startup or a fledgling blockchain project, it does make commercial sense to do as little testing as possible. It's just one of those unfortunate things in the way that business works. So that's covered testing and quality in software, hopefully. And I thought now we'll go on to part 3 and look at a number of cases where blockchains have gone wrong and why they went wrong. And the first one I'm going to look at is what I've titled bad password security. So this one's a Bitcoin one, and it goes back to about 2013 or so, where someone had the great idea that remembering Bitcoin passwords is very difficult because they are 256-bit numbers. That's a lot of ones and zeros to memorize. But they noticed that this computer function that was used in Bitcoin, something called the hash, is a function that takes as its input any kind of data, and it outputs a 256-bit number. And that 256-bit number behaves like a random number. You can't predict in advance what it's going to be, but if you put the same data in, you get the same 256-bit number out. And simply, it's irreversible. If someone gives you a 256-bit number, it's impossible to come up with some kind of data that you would need to put into this function in order to get that number. So they thought, this is great. You can take a simple, easy to remember passphrase, put it into the hash function, get a 256-bit number out, and that is conveniently what a Bitcoin private key is. And they call this a brain wallet, and it means you can carry your password around in your head. It turns out that this is a very bad thing to do because people are not very good at coming up with truly random passphrases. And so instead of your password being a random number between 0 and 2 to the power of 256, which is huge and therefore can never be guessed, you've shrunk the set of possible passphrases down to something that can actually be searched with a computer. And in computing terms, the entropy has been massively reduced. It becomes very predictable. And what happened was some people picked really bad passphrases, and I have some examples here. One, someone picked a passphrase, Bitcoin is awesome. And that guessed, and 500 Bitcoins got drained from their Bitcoin address. Another one, which when I first read it, I thought, well, how did anybody ever guess that? It was the phrase, you don't win friends with salad. And that one actually doesn't have a terrible ending. The account had 157 Bitcoins in it. Only 3 were taken, and they were returned by the person who took them. They just wanted to teach a lesson to the person who used this passphrase. And I found out later that the phrase, you don't win friends with salad, actually comes from a Simpsons episode. So that's why, although on the surface of it, it sounds really, really random, it's not random. Someone just had to take the scripts from the Simpsons and run them through a password cracker. And that allowed them to find the private key and steal the Bitcoins. We see this similar problem of bad password security in non-blockchain cases as well. The most famous recent one is the SolarWinds hack, where a company that made security software that was being relied on by Microsoft and the Pentagon and all sorts of government agencies got hacked. And it turns out that someone had created a backdoor password for them to test the system, and they'd used the password the company's called SolarWinds. So it doesn't take much password cracking to come up with that one as an independent hacker. So That's an example of a Bitcoin failure based on bad password security. And the next ones I'm going to look at are to do with Ethereum and smart contracts. And maybe it's worth having a brief chat about what smart contracts are. People say that they're not smart and they're contracts. Software developers say they are just small programs or pieces of code that you deploy to a smart contract blockchain such as Ethereum, and the nodes then run them as and when circumstances dictate it. So they're little programs sitting on the blockchain, and they can get triggered when people submit transactions to the blockchain that refer to them. One of the really neat things about smart contract blockchain systems is that they allow computer programs to own digital assets the way that Bitcoin allows human beings to own digital assets. So you, on Ethereum, you as a person can own Ether, which is the equivalent to Bitcoin on Ethereum. And I think at the moment it has a market value of about $3,000 per Ether. On Ethereum, you can actually transfer that value to a computer program, a smart contract, and then the program will do with those funds as it sees fit according to the code that the developer deployed. So in a sense, that's quite a revolutionary idea. It's as revolutionary as the idea of limited liability companies, which in law have standing as entities or people. So in the blockchain world, smart contracts can act like human beings and that they can own stuff and they can do stuff with the things that they own. The other thing that smart contracts can do is they can instantiate data structures, and those data structures can include things like tokens, such as non-tokens, or other kinds of cryptocurrencies. So very flexible, very interesting things. Also open up the door for all sorts of disasters. The first one I want to look at is something called the Distributed Autonomous Organization, or DAO. And it was a set of smart contracts that you could deposit Ether into, and then it worked like a venture capitalist fund where the people who put Ether into it could vote on handing that Ether over to projects that they wanted to fund. So it's like a VC firm without a CEO or anybody in charge. It's a democratic funding system. There were a few bugs found that got fixed, and then a really big bug showed up. At the point that the really big bug showed up, about 12 million ethers were deposited, which at the time was worth about $150 million. So you see, we're not talking about small amounts of money. The bug is to do with a code audit failure. Even though the code had been audited many times, the developers missed the fact that there was a technique that allowed people to withdraw more money than they put in. I think a good description of this bug is an ATM bug. If you go to a cash machine and you put your card in and you have money in your bank account, the cash machine checks what your balance is, looks at how much you're asking to withdraw. As long as the amount you're looking to withdraw is less than the balance in your bank account, it lets you withdraw it. Now, imagine an ATM that only checked your balance once and then allowed you to request again and again to withdraw cash. That would allow you to withdraw more cash than you had in your bank account. So let's say 100 in the bank account, you put your card in, you say, I'll withdraw 50. It checks once that you had 100 and says, yeah, here's 50 quid. Imagine if you could key in, yeah, I want to withdraw another 50, another 50, another 50. It doesn't go back each time and check that you have a lower balance. It still assumes that you had the original 100 and just keep feeding out 50 notes. And that's what happened to the DAO. And a hacker managed to drain about 4 million of the ethers. The result of that was that the community went into a bit of a tailspin. They had some huge discussions, and they actually decided to roll back the history of the Ethereum blockchain. Not everybody agreed, and it actually split the blockchain in two, but the majority agreed to roll back Ethereum and pretend that the whole thing hadn't happened. But anyway, there you go. That's what happened with the DAO. I'm just keeping an eye on the time here. I think we've got another 10 minutes or so. So I'll move on to the next case, which is the Parity multi-signature wallet fiasco. And this one was a code deployment failure. So the code had been audited. The code was effectively an online smart contract wallet that allowed people to deposit their funds into a wallet account, and then it could only be withdrawn if multiple people signed it. So it works a bit like a company bank account where the CEO and the CFO have to sign off on checks. And companies have these things to stop rogue CEOs from buying Lamborghinis with company funds. Now, the problem with this one was that when the code was deployed, in order to great, they forgot when they deployed the code had something called an owner. There was an initialization function, but when the code was deployed, the first person to run that function got set as the owner of the contract. And then there were a bunch of functions in the contract that only the owner could run. One of those functions, and this is another thing that they made a mistake on, was it was called a kill function that stopped the program from ever being able to be run again. A random person on the internet who just went by the handle DevOps9 found that the contract hadn't been claimed the ownership, and then ran the kill function. That froze all the funds that were in the wallet. And again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Ether at the time. This time, there wasn't a rollback, and those funds are still locked, and there is no way they will ever be retrieved. So that's a code deployment failure rather than a bug in the code itself. And I think now I'll just jump onto a third case and skip on. I think the one I want to talk about is non-fungible tokens, because they're quite hot at the moment. And this one I would call an interface failure. There's a standard for called ERC 721. What the standard requires is that your smart contract has the right interface. It needs to have a transfer function. It needs to have a minting function. It needs to have a function that gives you permission to allow other people to transfer a token on your behalf, and so on. So as long as you write some code that has the correct looking interface, then to everybody else, it will look like a non-token contract. You can list it on some of these sites that allow you to trade non-tokens. The issue I want to discuss here is something that is known as sleep minting, which is where you write a non-token smart contract that creates one of these NFTs, but the back-end code isn't what people would expect. You put a backdoor in that allows a specific address to also transfer the token, not just the token owner. It turns out that the NFT websites don't have either the skills or possibly the time or possibly both to review every single contract that is deployed on the Ethereum blockchain. So they just put up a disclaimer that says, we haven't verified this contract. If you do want to engage in trading with this, it is up to you to go and check that it is a genuine ERC 721 token without a backdoor. I guess this is kind of like having a car with a digital key. When you sell the car, you change the digital key so that the new owner is the one who owns it, but you keep a secret backdoor key so that you can go along later and use that key to steal the car back again. The fact is, of course, that the average person cannot go and audit a smart contract code. Even competent Solidity developers, smart contract coders, are not going to find this a trivial thing to engage in. And certainly nobody wants to go and audit smart contract code every time they go and use a smart contract, just in the same way that nobody wants to read all 27 pages of the terms and conditions, click through when they want to use a piece of software. So in practice, people just get on with it. The issue here is that some of these tokens are selling for tens of millions of dollars, and some of these smart contracts are locking up nowadays billions of dollars worth of cryptocurrency. And yet we just happily go ahead and most of the time use these things. So this is the problem I see in the non-marketplaces, is that you have no real guarantee that the token that you're buying can't be secretly removed from your wallet. You would have to order the code, and even I really wouldn't want to take the time to do that. The second problem that we have is that some of the websites misrepresent the information. If you go and look at OpenSea, it claims that the token is minted by the first address that it goes to. And in fact, you can find an article from my LinkedIn account where I show that it's possible to mint a token as though it was made by a famous online artist, when in fact it was made by me. So these are the problems we face when these blockchains are presented to ordinary users through interfaces. You don't know whether or not you can trust the interface. And again, this is a problem we see in the traditional world of software as well. When you go to a website and you think it's a genuine website, but somebody has changed a letter in the domain to, so it looks like it's an I, but it's an I with an accent on it. And you think you're going to Microsoft, you're going to MI Acute Soft. Your web browsing sessions being hijacked in a sense. So those were 3 cases where things in the blockchain world went wrong. So I think I just want to sum up with a conclusion of, well, what can we take away from this? There's now billions in value locked up in blockchain systems in the form of their cryptocurrencies and in these smart contracts. In fact, we're over $1 trillion now in terms of what some people call market capitalization for blockchains and cryptocurrencies. Because it's decentralized, if your funds are stolen from you, you don't have anybody to turn to in order to ask for the transaction to be undone. The systems are so complicated that the average person or even experts can't really audit the full system. It's too complicated, and sometimes the code isn't even available for you to go and look at. So really, it's the Wild West out there, and we don't even have any sheriffs in town yet. I guess that's the warning. When you're investing or speculating or trading in the blockchain world, you have to remember that it's not the tame, regulated world that we have for traditional finance. It's not gambling, but there are just extra risks that are involved, and you have to keep that in mind. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you found it interesting, and let's open up to questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Keir, and I found it fascinating. We do have a number of questions that have come in, and I had a few observations myself as well. It was interesting when you said about smart contracts. Smart contracts can now have ownership. It made me think of the artificial intelligence that I understand is in Saudi Arabia has residency so that she can be taxed. If we're going to the point where devices and things other than human beings and companies that we have a tax system for are going to be able to have those properties. Has anyone ever discussed the tax implications around those at all?
I haven't had many conversations about tax. It's a very complicated issue, actually, because you have all the different jurisdictions which have their own rules and regulations and rates and stuff like that. I mean, I think the thing to consider there is that we've got long-standing non-person entities that can be taxed, namely companies. Companies pay company tax. The governments audit those companies to ensure that they're complying. And of course, the companies go to great lengths to ensure that they're in the right jurisdiction in order to reduce their tax bill as much as possible. And in America, they even enter into negotiation with various states to get good deals to locate a particular place. I think it's going to be an interesting one when it comes to a decentralized smart contract. If that smart contract is holding cryptocurrency that has value or worth, and it starts making profit from it, who does a government tax? Glad I'm not the one who has to solve that problem. In Finland, it wouldn't be an issue because cryptocurrencies don't become a taxable event until they are converted into fiat. And of course, if you have a smart contract sitting on a blockchain and it is converting ether to DAI and DAI to BAT and then back to ether and making a profit, it's not off-ramping it to euros or dollars. However, I can see a future where, in fact, there's a Dutch family who I believe for years now have been, as an experiment, living solely off Bitcoin. I imagine at some point there are going to be more people who are conducting that kind of experiment. At that point, there are going to be governments that say, hang on a minute, just because you're not converting to our taxable currency doesn't mean you should get away with no taxes. I think that regulators and lawyers are going to have a field day working out exactly how they're going to be going about it. A well-constructed, decentralized system may just be impossible to tax. There may not be an entity that you can go to and say, give me that. But I suppose at some point, somebody's going to want to get their hands on the wealth.
I would have thought so, yes. As I say, we have a number of questions. And Jonathan, are you happy to read out your question and ask Keir directly yourself? Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? And
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Able to do that. Keir, it's good to hear from you. And just a part about exchanges. You mentioned earlier on that we're looking at a substitution from, say, the world of banking into what crypto offers. But aren't exchanges the new gatekeepers? Because they control processing, they control transactions, they control the entry and exit of fiat money, currency, and they charge fees for the work performed. In the case of Bitcoin, when we hit that hard limit, we're going to see a sort of free-for-all when it comes to what fees that they'll need to charge, because there won't be, miners won't be accruing compensation from their mining activities. What's your view on exchanges being those gatekeepers?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that if you want to go from fiat to crypto or crypto to fiat, you have to go through an exchange, and they are indeed charging fees. I would say that's to be expected, given that you are interfacing with the traditional fiat currency world. That's how that one functions. Once you're in the cryptocurrency world, then you no longer need to use centralized exchanges. Now there are decentralized exchanges, and they are kind of in a race to the bottom as to which one charges the least fees in order to run the service. But yeah, I agree, you're right. When it comes to transitioning between the cryptocurrency world or the token world and the traditional finance world, there are going to be gatekeepers, and I don't really see how there cannot be, because traditional currency requires a custodian. It requires somebody to be managing it, or some entity or company. I hope that answers your question to some extent.
Thanks. I think it's just interesting to reflect on the fact that, in effect, what we've done is translated the role of a bank or a banker into the role of an exchange, and equated the same degree of trust between the two, when in the current banking it's heavily regulated, and in the exchange world it's not. So I just want to question the thinking around translation.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, the regulations are coming for the exchanges. The ATF passed regulations or recommendations in 2019, and slowly making their way into law, that virtual asset service providers such as exchanges now have to do AML and KYC in the way that traditional financial institutions have to. And they're struggling with that, of course. But of course, those regulations are in place in order to stop money laundering and terrorism funding and stuff like that. It's not about keeping you and me as personal customers particularly safe or well catered for, just for society in general, I suppose. I guess the one thing with exchanges is that at least you can make it a one-time trip, that you have one transaction with an exchange, and then you're in the cryptocurrency world. And as long as you stay there, then you don't have to deal with them again. Whereas in the traditional financial world, you're kind of, I suppose, unless you got all your life savings in one go and converted them to cash, you have to deal with the traditional finance gatekeepers again and again for each transaction. I don't know what we can make of that, really, but you can turn it to one transaction rather than one every time you transact.
Thank you very much. And then Craig, would you like to ask your question yourself?
Sure. Thank you for hosting and being here. NFTs on the ERC21 contract, it just points to the URI, which is just is a link. How do we ensure that the image, the video, the piece of content that we're purchasing is forever available and hosted?
Well, good point. If it's just on a website, then of course we can't. Then it requires that website to be hosted, and If the person hosting the website with the image decides not to pay their domain fees and web hosting fees anymore, and then somebody else buys the domain and decides to put something else on that site at that URI, you've now got a token pointing to a totally different image. Their only feasible solution at the moment to this persistence problem that I've seen to date is the interplanetary file system, where you take your image, your JPEG, and when you upload it to an IPFS server, in part of the process is that the file name is changed to a hash, and the hash is generated from the content of the JPEG. And that means that that file names will stay consistent throughout time. This has a couple of ramifications. So one is that the URI to that particular JPEG will always be roughly the same. There can be a different precursor because you can have different IPFS servers that you would go and approach. But the end bit for the file name indicates where that file is and allows any IPFS file server to find it. And if for some reason all the IPFS file servers decide to stop hosting that particular JPEG, if at some point in the future someone uploads the same JPEG again, it ends up with exactly the same IPFS file name. And actually, this is one of the things that suggests to me that the IPFS needs a slight improvement, in that the URI for an IPFS file starts with the IPFS file server and then with the IPFS file name. And really, it shouldn't matter which IPFS file server you're using. So that first bit isn't important. That should actually be a setting in your web browser where you say, I like to use IPFS.io, or I like to use Pinata or something like that. And you should just be able to say, I want to find this file name. And then it retrieves for you. Therefore, the NTFS should in its URI just have the IPFS file name. And that would give you, as long as the IPFS system continues to run, that would give you persistence for that JPEG. But I happen to think that the URI part of NTFS is, it's a hacky attempt to link the on-chain token to some off-chain system. And I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. And don't even get started on trying to link it to things in the real world, because then you end a whole bunch of extra problems.
Something an Oracle can take care of.
Maybe.
Yeah. Thank you.
And when you're talking about the difficulties it was facing, you've mentioned there are pitfalls have come up because the testing hasn't been done properly, the auditing wasn't done correctly, there were flaws in the deployment, there potentially could be backdoors, and there's the subject of misrepresentation. Are there other industries that we can look to see how these areas might have been tackled to be able to bring in best practices to our industry?
Well, I think the problem we have is that the sort of traditional non-blockchain software industry is really broken. I follow a few people on LinkedIn who post security breaches, and you can find one a day. The cloud leaks like a sieve. The architecture of our computer systems started off on a basis of trust. When you look at how things like Unix were set up, it was kind of assumed that it was going to be running in a university where everyone was nice to each other. And most of the security solutions are kind of bolted on. And we've now got decades of infrastructure, and then we're trying to patch it by sticking things on the side and in front of it and behind it, rather than the core itself being strong. Then there is that second thing, that for business, ultimately it's about speed rather than reliability, because that's the way, it's the first to market win, or is more likely to win. The one that spends more money on their marketing budget may beat a better solution. So it's kind of inherent in the system that we've set up. The computing side didn't start from a security basis, and our commercial systems are not based on providing secure and robust software. They're based on building market awareness and market share. And we are too far down the road, I think, to throw it all away and start again. So I think we just kind of have to accept that it's all going to be a bit shoddy. And I think if you talk to people in, for example, the banking system, they'll quite readily tell you that banks are full of legacy systems written in old programming languages running on old boxes, and they don't dare turn them off, even though they have no idea what they're doing, because they're concerned that if they turn them off, then suddenly, some critical infrastructure part will stop working. And who knows what will happen if those boxes one day just give up the ghost. But that's kind of the way it is.
I think we've got time for one more question. Also, for any questions that we haven't had a chance to get to, perhaps you can reach out to Keir and ask him there, and we might be able to put them in a follow-up. So Miguel would like me to read out their question because they're in a noisy background. Assuming that blockchain responds to a new paradigm in terms of decentralization, transparency, governance, what main changes do you think should be made before in the traditional world, governments, companies, sector regulation, able to adopt in a general way? I don't know if I read that correctly.
So I guess that question is, how can governments go about adopting blockchain, given that at the moment it's more of a sort of people push, it's individuals pushing projects out. Have I understood that right, Bridget? Or I don't really grasp the gist of the question.
I guess it's asking if we're moving to a paradigm in terms of decentralization, transparency and governance, what do the traditional world like governments need to be able to do to keep up?
Well, governments aren't really built around moving quickly. So, having talked about the software industry and how it's move fast and break things, if I'm being cynical, I'd say a government is all about move slowly and spend lots of money. It's when you look at government IT projects, certainly in the UK, they don't have a marvelous track history in terms of cost efficiency or services provided. But I guess they're getting better over time. I don't really know. Maybe it's just a matter of them having people looking at this. I did some work for the Finnish Ministry of Transport about 2 or 3 years ago. And I found that governments are very good at and happy at sort of doing blue sky thinking funding. And they actually seem to be doing a reasonable job in terms of infrastructure. I certainly wouldn't want to take over their responsibility, but this middle ground, when it's not already established, is a bit difficult for them. And if you look at Geoffrey Moore, Crossing the Chasm, a book about the adoption of software, and there are these sort of categories of early adopters, and then at the other end you have, and I think governments are kind of required to fall into the sector that you don't want your government to be pushing out brand new untested technology when they are overseeing things like our health service or our electricity infrastructure, or our road infrastructure, or stuff like that. Because something as simple as putting a new toll system on a bridge over a river and then messing it up can have a huge impact. Can you imagine if you couldn't get across the Thames at Dartford for 4 or 5 days, and what that would do to London? So I guess they're required to be careful. But I think that they all pretty much now are following blockchain fairly intently. There's certainly lots of EU projects and committees and groups who are studying stuff, and there are now lots of funds going out to research projects and stuff. But I wouldn't expect them to jump on things immediately. So do you think that answers the question?
Thank you so much, Keir. We've had our full hour. I would like to ask everyone to show their appreciation for Keir by either taking your videos off or using the reactions that we've got. Also, I know that we've already got one of your copies of your book sold, but if you like what we're talking about, and one of the things that I really admire about Keir is that he has the ability to explain things in a language that a non-technical person can understand, and also explain to someone else, as well as being able to deep dive down into the difficulties, the technical aspects. So it's an absolute honor to have you with us. I will be sending a recording out to everyone, and if you'd like to know more about the Bigger Pie, then please do let me know. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Bridget, for having me.